The radio call came in fractured, half swallowed by static and the scream of wind through a shattered canopy. Any station. This is Viper 2-1, going down south of Kalat. Tell my kids. Then silence. Just the hiss of dead air and the faint crackle of a frequency no one wanted to hear go quiet. In the operations center at Kandahar Airfield, Major Nalen Reese stood frozen, headset pressed hard against his skull, waiting for something that wouldn't come. Around him, controllers stared at screens that showed nothing but empty desert and the blinking transponder of an F-16 that had just stopped transmitting. Viper 2-1 was Captain Derek Halford, father of 3, 14 years in the Air Force, and now a voice that had just said goodbye. The Taliban had been waiting. They knew the routes, knew the altitudes, knew when coalition aircraft flew low enough to matter. A shoulder-fired missile had clipped Halford's jet as he rolled in for a gun run on a convoy ambush. His wingman had seen the hit, seen the smoke, seen the Viper tumble into a spin before Halford punched out somewhere over the ridgeline. But that was 20 minutes ago. The parachute had been spotted by a Reaper drone, drifting down into a valley controlled by fighters who moved fast and carried the kind of hatred that didn't take prisoners for long. Reese had already scrambled 2 Apache gunships and a medevac Blackhawk, but they were 12 minutes out and the valley was crawling. Everyone in the room knew the math. Halford was alive, probably injured, definitely surrounded. The rescue package wasn't going to get there in time, not unless someone bought them minutes they didn't have. That's when the voice came through, calm and low, with the kind of West Texas drawl that belonged on a front porch, not a tactical frequency. Kandahar ground, this is Hog 03. I'm 40 miles south with playtime and a full load. I can be overhead in 6 mics. The controllers looked at each other. Hog 03, an A-10 Thunderbolt, the ugly, slow, beloved warthog that everyone underestimated until it showed up and stayed. But there was something else. The voice was familiar in a way that made Reese's jaw tight. He keyed the mic. Hog 03, say call sign and pilot name. There was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. Hog 03, call sign poet, Major Iris Navarro. Reese closed his eyes. Of course it was her. Iris Navarro had been flying A-10s for 11 years, and for most of those years she'd been the punchline of jokes she never asked to hear. It wasn't her skill, that was undeniable. It was everything else. She was quiet in the debrief room, precise in the cockpit, and she had a habit of quoting dead poets during mission briefs in a way that made younger pilots roll their eyes. Yeats, Frost, Wilfred Owen. She'd name them softly, like they mattered, like words could hold weight in a world made of steel and fire. They called her poet, and not always kindly. But Iris didn't fly for approval. She flew because the A-10 was the only aircraft that made sense to her, a machine built to save lives by taking hits no one else would survive. It was slow, ugly, armored like a battering ram, and it stayed in the fight long after sleeker jets went home. Just like her. She'd been shot down once before, over Helmand Province, back in 2011. She'd ejected at 300 feet, broken her collarbone and 2 ribs on landing, and spent 18 hours evading Taliban patrols before a SEAL team pulled her out of a dry riverbed. She'd never talked about it much, just wrote a poem later that someone found in her locker. It was about silence and dust, and how the sky looked when you thought you'd never see it again. After that, people stopped joking as much. But they never stopped underestimating her. Today, Iris had launched on a routine patrol from Bagram, hauling 11 Maverick missiles, a full drum of 30mm cannon rounds, and enough fuel for 3 hours of loiter time. She'd been flying a lazy racetrack pattern over the Hindu Kush when the distress call came through. She didn't ask permission. She just pointed the nose south and shoved the throttles forward. The A-10 didn't go fast, but it went steady, and steady was enough when someone was dying. Now she was inbound to a valley she'd never seen, to save a man she'd never met, and every second mattered. She checked her fuel, her weapons, her maps. She activated her targeting pod and began scanning the ridgelines for movement, for smoke, for anything that looked like a man trying to stay alive. Viper 2-1, Hog 03, if you're listening, help is coming. Stay low, stay quiet, I'll find you. Derek Halford was pressed flat against a boulder, blood running down his left leg from a gash that had opened when he hit the ground. His parachute was tangled in thorn bushes 50 yards uphill, a white flag that told everyone exactly where he'd landed. He'd already heard voices, Pashto, carried on the wind, getting louder. His sidearm was in his hand, 9 rounds left, and he knew that wasn't going to be enough. He tried the radio twice, but his survival radio was damaged, crackling with static every time he keyed the mic. So he stopped trying. He thought about his kids, Riley, 8 years old, who wanted to be a pilot like him, Mason, 6, who still believed his dad was invincible, and Emma, 4, who cried every time he deployed. He thought about his wife, Carla, who'd begged him not to take this assignment, who'd known, somehow, that this deployment felt different. He'd kissed her at the airport and told her he'd be fine. Now he was bleeding into Afghan dirt, listening to men with rifles getting closer. He closed his eyes and started praying, not for rescue, but for his family to be okay without him. That's when he heard it. Low, guttural, unmistakable. The sound of turbofan engines pulling thick air through metal, the growl of an aircraft built for punishment. He opened his eyes and looked up. Through the haze and dust and his own failing focus, he saw it. An A-10 Warthog flying so low the sun flashed off its titanium bathtub cockpit, wings heavy with ordnance, nose painted with teeth like a shark that had learned to fly. It banked hard over the ridgeline, and for the first time since he'd punched out, Derek Halford thought he might live. Iris saw him immediately. The thermal pod painted him in white against the cold rocks, a human shape curled small, trying to disappear. She marked his position, then swept east. 30 seconds later, she found them. 12 fighters moving in a loose skirmish line, AK-47 slung, one man carrying an RPG launcher. They were 200 yards from Halford and closing. She didn't hesitate. Kandahar ground, Hog 03 has visual on Viper 2-1 and multiple hostiles closing his position. Request clearance to engage. Major Reese's voice came back instantly. Hog 03, you are cleared hot, keep him alive. Iris rolled inverted, pulled the nose down, and began her run. The A-10 didn't dive like an F-16. It didn't scream. It descended like a hammer, slow and inevitable, the kind of arrival that gave you just enough time to know what was coming. She pickled off 2 Mavericks, one after the other, sending them downrange with a thunk that rattled the airframe. The missiles streaked toward a cluster of fighters moving through a dried-out wadi, their infrared seekers locked on body heat and engine signatures. The first Maverick hit a technical, a Toyota Hilux with a heavy machine gun bolted in the bed. The explosion turned the truck into a fireball that rolled black smoke into the sky. The second missile took out 3 men who'd been running for cover. The shockwave knocked 2 more flat. Iris didn't watch the impacts. She was already lining up her gun. The GAU-8 Avenger was a 30mm rotary cannon, the kind of weapon that made the A-10 exist. The jet was built around the gun, not the other way around. 7 barrels, 65 rounds per second, each one the size of a beer bottle and made to punch through tank armor. Iris squeezed the trigger. The sound was legendary, a deep, ripping BRRRT that echoed off the mountains and made the airframe shudder. A line of dirt and rock exploded across the hillside, walking toward the remaining fighters like the hand of God dragging a finger through sand. 2 men disintegrated. Another lost an arm and dropped, screaming into dirt that was already soaked red. The survivors scattered, sprinting for cover, but there was no cover from an A-10 on a gun run. Iris pulled up, rolled wings level, and came around again. Derek heard the gun before he understood what it was. It sounded like the sky being torn open, a mechanical roar that didn't belong in nature. Then he saw the impacts, the earth erupting in geysers of dust and stone, the line of destruction marching across the hillside where the Taliban fighters had been moments before. He didn't move. He just watched, breath held, as the A-10 climbed, banked, and came around for another pass. This time, Iris dropped cluster munitions, old-school CBU-87s that burst over the ridgeline and scattered bomblets like rain. Each one detonated with a sharp crack, sending shrapnel through rocks and flesh. The valley filled with smoke and dust and the smell of cordite carried on the wind. When the third pass was done, there was nothing left to shoot. The fighters were gone, dead, scattered, or running so fast they'd forgotten why they came. Iris leveled out at 2,000 feet and keyed her radio. Viper 2-1, Hog 03, hostiles neutralized, stay where you are, rescue is inbound. Derek keyed his damaged radio, voice shaking. Hog, thank you, I thought I was done. Iris's voice came back steady, almost gentle. You're not done, Viper, you've got kids to go home to. I'm staying overhead until they get you out. And she did. For the next 14 minutes, while the Apache gunships and the medevac Blackhawk screamed south through the valleys, Iris Navarro flew slow circles over Derek Halford's position. She didn't fire again. She didn't need to. The A-10's presence was enough. The remaining Taliban fighters saw the Warthog orbiting like a bird of prey and stayed hidden, too afraid to move, too smart to challenge an aircraft that had just wiped out a dozen men in 3 passes. When the Blackhawk finally landed and the PJs sprinted out to grab Derek, Iris watched through her targeting pod. She saw them lift him onto a stretcher, saw the medic start an IV, saw the rotors kick up dust as the helo climbed out. Iris stayed on station until the Blackhawk was safely out of the valley, escorted by the 2 Apache flying tight formation on either side. Only then did she turn north and begin the long flight back to Bagram. Her fuel was low. Her gun drum was nearly empty. Her hands were steady on the stick, but her chest felt tight, and she realized she'd been holding her breath for most of the mission. She exhaled slowly, let the adrenaline drain, and keyed the radio one last time. Kandahar ground, Hog 03. Viper 2-1 is secure, I'm RTB. Major Reese's voice came back, quieter than before. Copy, Hog 03. Good work today, poet, really good work. Iris didn't respond, she just flew. The sun was setting behind the mountains, turning the sky into bands of orange and purple and deep indigo. The Hindu Kush stretched below her like broken teeth, ancient and unforgiving, the kind of landscape that swallowed men whole and didn't give them back. But today it had. She thought about the voice on the radio, the way Derek Halford had said, "Tell my kids," like it was the last thing he'd ever say. She thought about her own father, a B-52 pilot who died over Hanoi in 1972, shot down before she was born. She'd grown up with stories and a folded flag and a poem her mother kept in a Bible, something about how the dead don't rest, they just wait in the sky. She joined the Air Force because of him. She flew the A-10 because it was the jet that brought people home. And today she had. When Iris landed at Bagram, the maintenance crew was waiting. They saw the empty pylons, the carbon scoring on the gun barrels, the faint smell of gunpowder still clinging to the airframe. They didn't say much. They just nodded and got to work. Iris climbed out, pulled off her helmet, and walked toward the debrief room with her flight suit still damp with sweat. The debrief took an hour. Iris sat in a gray room with fluorescent lights and a digital recorder, walking through the mission step by step with an intelligence officer who took notes and asked the kind of questions that made sure everything was legal and justified. It always was. The A-10 didn't waste bullets. When she was done, she stood, stretched, and walked out into the cool Afghan night. The base was quiet, just the hum of generators and the distant whine of a jet spooling up on the flight line. She walked to her quarters, a plywood hut with a narrow bed and a locker that barely closed. She sat down, unlaced her boots, and pulled a small notebook from her thigh pocket. It was battered, oil-stained, filled with lines of verse she'd written during downtime between missions. She flipped to a blank page and started writing. She didn't know what it would say yet, but she knew it was about today. About a man who thought he was going to die. About a machine that wouldn't let him. About the strange, terrible grace of violence in service of life. She wrote for 20 minutes, then stopped, closed the notebook, and lay back on the bed. Sleep didn't come easy. It never did after a mission like this. But eventually her breathing slowed, and she drifted off with the sound of turbofans still echoing in her mind. 3 days later, Derek Halford was medevac to Landstuhl, Germany, for surgery on his leg. The doctors said he'd walk again, maybe even fly again, though that would take time. His wife flew out to meet him, and when she walked into the hospital room and saw him alive, she broke down crying. Derek held her and told her about the A-10, about the voice on the radio, about the sound of the gun that had saved his life. "I need to find her," he said. "I need to thank her." Carla nodded, wiping her eyes. "Then we'll find her." took 2 weeks and a dozen emails, but eventually Derek got a message through to Bagram. Major Iris Navarro was still flying missions, still orbiting valleys and ridgelines, still staying in the fight longer than anyone expected. When she got the message, she read it twice, then folded the paper and put it in her locker. She didn't need thanks. She'd done her job, but she appreciated that he'd tried. A month later, she was reassigned stateside, rotated back to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. The A-10 squadrons were facing budget cuts, and there was talk of retiring the Warthog entirely. Politicians said it was too old, too slow, not relevant in modern warfare. Pilots like Iris knew better. The A-10 wasn't fast or sleek, but it was there when it mattered, and that was worth more than speed. She spent her days flying training sorties over the desert, teaching younger pilots how to fly low, stay steady, and bring people home. She didn't talk much about Afghanistan. She didn't need to. Her reputation had followed her back, carried on stories that moved through squadrons like folklore. The pilot who'd saved Viper 2-1, the one who flew into a valley alone and came out clean, the one they called Poet, who quoted Yeats and fired Mavericks with the same quiet precision. Respect came slowly in the fighter community, earned in increments of skill and courage, and the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. Iris had earned it. And for the first time in her career, people stopped underestimating her. One afternoon, she was walking across the flight line when she saw a man in civilian clothes standing near the squadron building. He was tall, mid-30s, walking with a slight limp. Next to him was a woman and 3 kids, the oldest holding a handmade sign that said, "Thank you, Hog 03. Iris stopped. Derek Halford smiled, limped forward, and extended his hand. "Major Navarro, I've been looking for you." Iris shook his hand, felt the firmness of his grip, the weight of gratitude in it. She didn't know what to say. She'd never been good at moments like this. Derek didn't wait for words. He gestured to his family. "This is my wife, Carla, and these are my kids, Riley, Mason, and Emma. They wanted to meet the pilot who made sure I came home." Riley, the oldest, stepped forward holding the sign. She looked up at Iris with wide eyes. "Dad says you saved his life. He says you flew through fire." Iris knelt down so she was eye level with the girl. She smiled, something she didn't do often, but it felt right. "I flew through smoke," she said, "but your dad did the hard part. He stayed alive long enough for me to find him. That takes courage." Riley nodded seriously, like she understood. Emma, the youngest, stepped closer and handed Iris a folded piece of paper. It was a crayon drawing of an A-10, green and gray, with a stick figure in the cockpit and the words "Thank you" written in uneven letters across the top. Iris took it carefully, like it was fragile. "This is beautiful," she said. "Can I keep it?" Emma nodded, then hugged Iris's leg before running back to her mother. Derek cleared his throat, his voice thick. "I don't know how to thank you, Major. I really don't. I was ready to die out there. I'd made peace with it. And then I heard your voice and I don't know, everything changed." Iris stood, still holding the drawing. She looked at Derek, then at his family, and something inside her shifted. She'd spent years flying missions, saving lives, doing the job without expecting recognition. But seeing them here, seeing the man alive, the wife smiling, the kids who still had a father, it made the weight of it real in a way it had never been before. "You don't owe me anything," she said quietly. "I just did my job." Derek shook his head. "No, you did more than that. You stayed. You didn't leave until I was safe. That's not just a job. That's something else." Carla stepped forward, eyes red. "We'll never forget what you did, Major. Never." Iris nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't good at accepting praise. She'd spent so much of her career being dismissed, underestimated, tolerated, but not celebrated. This felt different. It felt earned. They talked for a few more minutes, exchanged contact information, took a photo together in front of an A-10 parked on the flight line. Derek insisted on standing next to the jet, one hand on the fuselage, his family around him. Iris stood off to the side, still in her flight suit, hands in her pockets, uncomfortable with the attention but grateful for the moment. When they finally said goodbye, Derek shook her hand one last time. "If you ever need anything, Major, anything, you call me." "I mean it," Iris smiled. "I'll remember that." She watched them walk away, the kids laughing, Riley still holding the sign, Emma skipping between her parents. Derek limped, but he walked steady, and that was enough. Iris turned back toward the flight line, the drawing still in her hand. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her thigh pocket next to her notebook. That night she added a new entry. It wasn't a poem this time. It was just a line, something she'd been thinking about since the day she pulled Derek out of that valley. The sky doesn't care who you are. It only cares if you stay. She closed the notebook and went to bed. The next morning she flew again. Over the next year, Iris Navarro became something she'd never expected to be, a symbol. Not because she wanted to, but because people needed one. The story of Hog 03 spread beyond the squadron, beyond Davis-Monthan, beyond the Air Force. It showed up in military journals, in online forums where veterans traded stories, in a blog post written by Derek Halford that went viral and got picked up by news outlets. People loved it. The underestimated pilot. The ugly jet. The impossible rescue. It fit a narrative that people wanted to believe, that skill and courage still mattered, that the old warhorses still had a place, that quiet competence could save lives when flashy technology couldn't. Iris didn't read most of it. She kept flying. But the attention changed things. Younger pilots started asking her questions in the debrief room. Maintainers stopped joking and started listening when she talked about the jet. Commanders started assigning her the hard missions, the ones that required patience and precision and a willingness to take fire and keep flying. She became the pilot they called when someone was in trouble, and she answered every time. The A-10 community rallied around her, used her story to fight the budget cuts, to argue that the Warthog was still relevant, still necessary. Congress held hearings. Generals testified. And in the end, the A-10 got a reprieve. Another decade of service, another generation of pilots who'd learned to fly low and stay in the fight. Iris didn't take credit for that, but she knew she'd played a part. One evening, after a long flight over the Arizona desert, she sat alone in the squadron bar, nursing a beer and reading a new poem she'd been working on. It was about machines and men, about the strange partnership between steel and flesh, about how some things are built to break and others are built to endure. A young lieutenant sat down across from her. His name was Parker, fresh out of flight school, eager and nervous. "Major Navarro," he said, "can I ask you something?" Iris looked up, set down her notebook. "Go ahead." Parker hesitated, then leaned forward. "How do you do it? How do you stay calm when everything's falling apart?" Iris considered the question. She'd been asked variations of it before, but never quite like that. She thought about Derek Halford bleeding into the rocks. She thought about the gun run, the Mavericks, the way the valley had filled with smoke and silence. She thought about her father who'd never come home and the folded flag her mother still kept. "You don't stay calm," she said. "You just decide what matters and then you do the job." Parker nodded slowly like he was trying to memorize the words. "They say you're the best A-10 pilot in the Air Force." Iris smiled faintly. "They say a lot of things." "Do you believe it?" She took a sip of her beer, then looked at him. "I believe the jet works. I believe training works. I believe that if you show up and do the job right, people go home. That's all that matters." Parker sat back, quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I hope I'm half as good as you someday." Iris closed her notebook and stood. "You will be, just stay in the fight." She left him there and walked out into the desert night. The air was cool, the sky impossibly clear, filled with stars that looked close enough to touch. She stood on the flight line and looked at the row of A-10s parked in silence, their ugly, beautiful shapes silhouetted against the horizon. These jets weren't fast. They weren't elegant, but they stayed. And that was enough. Iris thought about Derek Halford's kids, about the crayon drawing still tucked in her locker, about the lines she'd written in her notebook. "The sky doesn't care who you are. It only cares if you stay." She stayed. Years passed. Iris Navarro flew missions over Syria, over Iraq, over the same valleys and ridgelines where she'd saved Derek Halford. She trained new pilots, mentored young officers, and quietly built a legacy that didn't need headlines or awards. She became a colonel, then a squadron commander, then the kind of leader people followed not because they had to, but because they wanted to. She never married. She never had kids. But she had the sky, and she had the jet, and she had the knowledge that every time she climbed into the cockpit, she was doing something that mattered. In 2034, the Air Force finally began phasing out the A-10. The jet had lasted longer than anyone expected, outlived 3 generations of politicians who tried to kill it, and saved more lives than any accountant could count. Iris flew one of the last combat missions, a close air support sortie over Africa where insurgents had pinned down a small team of special operators. She dropped bombs, fired the gun, and stayed overhead until the rescue was complete. When she landed, the maintainers painted a final kill marking on the side of her jet, a small silhouette of a man with the words, "They all came home," underneath. Iris touched the painting, ran her fingers over the words, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. She retired 6 months later at 53 years old with 30 years of service and more combat hours than most pilots would fly in a lifetime. The ceremony was small. Just her squadron, a few friends, and Derek Halford, who'd flown in from Virginia with his family. Riley was in college now, studying aerospace engineering. Mason was in high school talking about joining the Air Force. Emma was 12, quiet and thoughtful, carrying a notebook everywhere she went. Derek gave a speech. He talked about the day he thought he was going to die, about the voice on the radio, about the A-10 that came low and burning but alive. He talked about how Iris Navarro had given him a second chance, and how he'd spent every day since trying to be worth it. When Derek finished, Riley stepped forward and handed Iris a framed photograph. It was the picture they'd taken years ago, standing in front of the A-10 at Davis-Monthan. Derek was smiling, his arm around Carla, the kids gathered close. And Iris was off to the side, hands in her pockets, looking at the camera like she wasn't sure she belonged there. But she did. She always had. Iris took the frame, looked at the photo, and felt her throat tight. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for remembering." Derek shook his head. "We'll never forget, Major, never." The ceremony ended. People shook her hand, said kind words, drifted away. Iris walked alone to the flight line one last time. The A-10s were still there, waiting for the next pilot, the next mission. She stood in front of her old jet, the one with "Poet" stenciled below the canopy, and placed her hand on the fuselage. The metal was warm from the sun, solid and real. She thought about all the missions, all the valleys, all the men and women who'd gone home because this ugly, unloved machine had refused to quit. She thought about the poems she'd written, the lines that tried to capture what it felt like to fly low and stay in the fight. She thought about the sky and the silence and the strange, terrible grace of doing what needed to be done. Then she stepped back, saluted the jet, and turned away. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. She'd done her job, and that was enough. Iris Navarro walked off the flight line, into the Arizona sun, and into the rest of her life. Behind her, the A-10 sat silent, waiting for the next pilot who'd need it, the next impossible mission, the next person who needed to come home. The sky doesn't care who you are. It only cares if you stay. And Iris Navarro had stayed longer than anyone.